All right, today we are talking about the woodwind family. So remember that woodwind instruments are instruments that produce sound by blowing into them. Okay. There are all the instruments are made of different materials. They have different methods of their mouthpieces with reeds, no reeds, double reeds, all sorts of stuff. But you blow into the woodwind instrument to get it to make sound. Okay. So our first instrument is the flute. Okay. The flute you're going to find all the time in the orchestra. There's going to be probably at least two, maybe three or four. One of the flute players is going to double on piccolo when they need it. So they'll play the flute when they need it, and if they need the piccolo, they'll play the piccolo instead. So the flute, it's similar to the recorder in that it doesn't have a reed or anything. Fingerings are very similar. It has more keys and to get different sounds than the recorder does, but like the basic fingerings are the same as they are on a recorder and the flute. The biggest difference, obviously, is the way that you hold the flute. The recorder you hold in front of you, the flute you hold parallel to the floor. The piccolo is the exact same instrument as the flute, except for that it is about half the size, which makes it twice as high, and it happens to be about twice as loud. So you'll rarely ever have more than one piccolo in an orchestra, but you will see them if you see like a marching band outside marching, they'll likely be playing piccolos and not flutes, just because it's easier to hear the piccolo. But inside, the piccolo can be super loud. So there are a variety of different kinds of flutes that are just interesting to look at. They're not common though. So we've got the flute, we've got the piccolo. So the flute we see all the time. It plays all the time. It's one of the main instruments in the orchestra. Okay. So here is what it sounds like. We're listening for the quality of the sound. Okay. This is pretty low in the flute's range. And you can hear the breathing, the breath sounds with the flute. And so it has this very kind of light and airy, kind of swirly quality to it. And the sound is very, it's not a real sharp sound, at least when it's playing lower. And so just kind of remembering that and it's going to sound, I'm finding that a lot of kids find it similar to the clarinet. And so trying to figure out how to tell it apart from the clarinet. The flute has kind of more of this swirly kind of sound to it, which is hard to explain. Here is the piccolo. The piccolo is a bonus instrument. I want you to know that it exists, but if you don't remember it exactly like perfectly, that's okay. I need you to remember the flute. It's okay if you don't remember the piccolo. Okay, the piccolo. Remember, this is the same thing as the flute, except for way higher. Okay, all right. So we've got the oboe. The oboe is the one we're worried about. I'm going to mention the English one, but we're not even going to listen to it. That's how much of a bonus instrument it is. I do not need you to remember this, okay? So the oboe is a very important instrument in the orchestra. It sits next to the flutes. There are two oboes, and the oboes are responsible for tuning the orchestra. So they play the note that everybody tunes to. They play it. People tune. The sections take turns, so that we make sure that the whole symphony is in tune with each other. The oboe doesn't really have a mouthpiece in the way that like a flute or a clarinet does. The reed, which is this, it sticks right into the top of the instrument. So a reed is, the things in the ponds that the birds sit on. Those are reeds. Those are cattails or reeds. And so it's this kind of woodsy, planty, papery wood kind of thing. Might call it cane, or they call it reed. And so it's this very thin wood grass material. And a double reed you have two sides to it, and so and they're tied together. When you and then it has there's a hole in the middle. So then when your mouth goes on top of it, so when you blow into it, the sides are vibrating up against each other. Okay, and you can see that there is a hollow on the inside here. So the sound that you're hearing is the reed, paper, the wood, whatever it is, vibrating against itself, and it gives it this kind of almost scratchy, what they call a reedy quality. And it's a reedy quality because it comes from reeds. And so it might be kind of more, I think of it as more of like a nasal sound, like a, or you think like a duck, which in Peter and the Wolf, the duck is played by the oboe, plays the duck part. And there's a reason for that, because if you get that sound is kind of where this reedy thing is coming from, okay? Now, it's a beautiful instrument if you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, it can sound not so great. English horn is basically the same thing as the oboe, except for it's bigger, similar to the violin and the viola. However, the English horn is not seen a lot in the orchestra. They'll bring it in for a specific song, but you'll see it every once in a while. You will not see it every single time in the orchestra, okay? So we're not even gonna listen to it. This is the oboe. Oboe is one of my favorites. It's just so unique sounding. So you can kind of hear how the sound on an oboe is just a lot more kind of brighter or forward than it's not as like kind of floaty and swirly as the flute is. It's got more edge to it. It's got that kind of scratchiness to it. Okay. And we've got the clarinet. So the clarinet, ooh, come back, clarinet. There we go. The clarinet is it's a very important instrument in the orchestra. There are 2 to 3 of them that play in the orchestra, and they'll play a lot of melodies. The sound of the clarinet is very smooth, and it can also play. It's also used in like jazz music and things like that. So it uses a single reed, which means there is one piece of that wood, grass, reed material, and you can see it here. You attach it to the mouthpiece with this metal thing. It's called a ligature, and you tighten it. The reeds have to be wet in order to make this sound. So like for an oboe reed, you would dip it in water and let it soak. For a single reed, you suck on it. So you see people walking around with the reed sticking out of their mouth. You're like, what are they doing? Well, they gotta make it wet for the instrument to play. Double reeds need to be more wet because there's two sides to it, and the single reeds are a little easier to get wet. So there are different kinds of clarinets, different note ranges and things like that. And there's this bass clarinet here, which it's just a really, really big clarinet. It sits on the floor. There's a little end pin. But the most common is the B flat clarinet. Okay, so that's the one that's the one we refer to as the clarinet. We're going to listen to it. And so it has this same kind of smooth quality as the flute, but the flute is going to be kind of more the swirly, light, airy kind of sound. And the clarinet is going to be a lot more solid sounding. And it's also quite a bit lower as well. It can be. Okay. That riff, that one we just listened to, the kids always turn around and look at me when I play that for them. I wish I knew how to actually play it. That is the opening from Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin, and it is just a fantastic song. And that clarinet solo at the beginning, that's how the song opens. It's so cool. All right, so hopefully you can hear. It's just a different. It's a much kind of straighter sound, smooth. The flute is kind of the swirly sound. The oboe has this kind of scratchy quality, and then the clarinet is just very smooth and solid. Okay. That is not the button I meant to hit. That's the button I meant to hit. All right, so we've got the bassoon. So you will see both of these instruments in the orchestra. I want you to concentrate on the bassoon, but the contrabassoon is an instrument that you usually see in the symphony if you have someone who can play it. It's a little bit like the harp. It's a little bit more obscure. It's big. It's expensive, but you're more likely to find a bassoon player than a contrabassoon player just because the instrument is bigger and more expensive. So bassoon uses a double reed as well. The reed itself is a little bit bigger than an oboe reed, but the instrument's a lot bigger. The bassoon is about 4 feet tall, and you can use it. You can play it by either having a harness, like a chest harness that kind of goes around and holds the instrument because it is pretty heavy, or you can use a seat strap where this is kind of just a little belt thing that you sit on, and it's got a cup on the end for the end of the instrument to go in. This is a bocal with a B, B-O-C-A-L, bocal. The reed goes, you put the reed here into the instrument, and then this side of the bocal attaches to the instrument. You blow into the reed, the air goes through the bocal into the instrument, makes the sound, it comes out the top, okay? So the bassoon is the low end of the winds. So the flute, oboe, clarinet are the higher winds, and the bassoon and the contrabassoon are the low winds. Okay, let's take a listen to the bassoon. The excerpt you're going to hear the second time is from it's called The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and it's in Fantasia when like the basement floods and Mickey's like making magic to get the mops to mop up all the water in the basement. So here's Twinkle Twinkle. So and also in like the new version of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, they use that. It's called The Sorcerer's Apprentice, the song. They use that in the new one as well when they're trying to clean up the flooding water. All right, and so then that's the bassoon. The bassoon, okay. It will play the melody, but it plays a lot of harmony and just kind of adds a lot of texture to the orchestra. You can hear just that kind of scratchy quality similar to the oboe, but it's much, much lower. The contrabassoon, the most interesting thing about the contrabassoon is that it produces the lowest note in the symphony orchestra. So not the tuba, not the bass, the contrabassoon, okay? This one is significantly bigger than than the regular bassoon. It just has more bends and stuff in it, and has a little end pin at the bottom to sit on the ground, and you would wear a harness of some sort to keep it close to your body to help kind of make sure that you don't drop it because it is pretty heavy. It also has a bocal with the double reed, just like the bassoon. So let's take a listen to the contrabassoon. So like even I can hear how this sounds very similar to the string bass. Just it has a similar kind of that raspy quality to it, that scratchiness to it. This sound is a little bit thinner, and the bass sound is going to be a little bit rounder sounding, just a little fuller sounding. This one sounds a little bit less full to me, a little like just more nasally, more kind of sound to it. That's the best that I can do. I will not ask you to identify this instrument as a sound excerpt, okay? So I'm not trying to trick you, I'm trying to help you. All right, I will ask you about the bassoon. I will not ask you about the sound of the contrabassoon, okay? All right. And then we have other woodwind instruments. You'll notice that we did not talk about the saxophone because the saxophone is not a symphony instrument. The saxophone was made as a marching instrument, which means that it's a military instrument, and so it was made to be played outside. It is just a very, very loud instrument, and it will just overtake the other instruments in the orchestra, especially like the strings and the other wind instruments. You may see a saxophone in there every once in a while, just as a special guest. That someone wrote something with a saxophone in it. It's not going to happen very often. The most common, like the one that you learn how to play like in band, is the alto saxophone. And then you have ones that are bigger, and then you have ones that are higher. The most common are the alto tenor and the baritone sax. It's called the bari sax. It's just the different. You've got the high one, you've got the really high one, the high one, the medium, medium low, low, really low. And so when you're in high school and you want to play the saxophone, you start on the alto, you could maybe change to the tenor, which is a little bit lower, then the baritone. So saxophones. And then the recorder family is also a wind instrument. And we would play this one, the soprano recorder is the one we played. And then there's just different sizes that just add more texture, more depth. The recorder used to be a very popular instrument from like medieval to Renaissance times. And that was before these other instruments were modernized and made accessible to other people, kind of perfected. And so the recorder just kind of fell away. It's a pretty simple instrument, and you can do a lot more, get a lot more quality sound out of like a flute or a clarinet. And so kind of just fell out of favor, but there's tons of music written for the recorder that would have been played in concert halls and stuff like that. So the wind section, it's very interesting. Remember, they make sound by blowing into the instrument. All right, we're gonna watch Grant with his orchestra, and if you look and see, you'll see they'll play the piccolo as well as the flute. You'll see the English horn sitting with the oboes. They won't point it out, but it's there. It's the one that's sitting closest to, and it's a little bit longer. You'll see the bass clarinet, which is sitting with the clarinets, but they won't talk about it. It's the one that sits on the floor. And then you will also, they will specifically point out the contrabassoon. So just kind of listening to how the instruments sound different, because we're going to trying to figure out how to tell them apart. So how are you going to tell apart the flute and the clarinet? How are you going to tell apart the oboe from the flute, the clarinet, and the bassoon? So just kind of be thinking about those kinds of things while you're listening to that. All right? Okay, I'll see you guys.